Late autumn in the Judith Basin, and the grass has gone the color of old rope. Wind drags snow dust along the ground in low, flat sheets that hiss against anything standing. The cottonwood along the creek is bare. The air tastes like iron. A man crouches at the mouth of a hole cut into a south-facing bank. Not a cabin, not a soddy, just a low dirt opening with a crooked door and a stovepipe leaning against the slope because there is no way to make it draw. Behind him, thin sheep stand in a pen of willow poles and chew at nothing. Against the outside wall, a woodpile so small it fits under a torn coat. Peter Flatten had arrived in the Judith Basin with nothing that looked like a future. September of 1887, and the outfit that had hired him 2 years earlier to tend sheep along the Moccasin Creek drainage was already dead. The owner had gone east after the previous winter killed half his cattle and most of his credit. He left behind debts, a collapsed bunkhouse, and a scrawled note tacked to a fence post that said, "The remaining stock belonged to whoever stayed long enough to claim it." Pater stayed. Not because he wanted 83 thin ewes and a cracked blade shear, because his sister Eli was 16 years old and working in a laundry near Fort Benton, and he had promised her passage money before spring. That promise was the only structure his life had left. Without it, he was a 26-year-old Norwegian with a bad left foot, no family in the territory, and a vocabulary that still tripped over English when he was tired. The sheep were his now. So was the dugout. 12 feet wide, 14 feet deep, cut into a south-facing cut bank where the soil was dense enough to hold shape, but wet enough to sweat when the weather shifted. The front wall was scrap poles, sod blocks, and one salvage door that hung crooked on leather hinges. The back and side walls were raw earth, brown, cold, and slick to the touch after any rain. Pater could stand upright if he stayed in the center. Near the walls, where the ceiling sloped to meet the bank, he had to duck. He owned one small sheet iron stove. The stovepipe was cracked at the second joint and leaked smoke when the wind came from the north, which in the Judith Basin meant most days between October and March. He had less than a cord of mixed willow and cottonwood, none of it properly seasoned. He had no money for coal haulage. He had no money for anything. The dugout met the bare legal definition of a claim shelter. It would not meet winter. Tullough Moan arrived on a Tuesday in early October, driving a freight wagon loaded with hides bound for the river landing. Tullough was 58, Norwegian-born like Peter, but 20 years longer in Montana, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he hauled. He was respected in the basin not because he was kind, though he could be, but because he was usually right. When Tullough said a thing would fail, men listened. He did not knock. He pushed the dugout door open, stood in the frame, and let his eyes adjust to the dark. Peter was inside, trying to patch the stovepipe joint with a strip of tin cut from a can. His hands were black with soot. The air smelled like damp earth and cold iron. Tullough looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling, where moisture beaded along a root that had pushed through the sod. He looked at the stove, the woodpile beside it, the single blanket on the sleeping shelf. Then he stepped back outside and looked at the sheep pen, a crooked enclosure of willow poles and salvaged wire, where 83 ewes stood in mud and chewed at nothing. "How much wood do you have?" Tullough said. "Less than a cord. You need 6, minimum. 6 cords of seasoned hardwood to keep that stove fed from November through March. And you do not have hardwood. You have green willow and cottonwood that will smoke more than it burns." Tullough pointed at the dugout walls. "A dirt wall drinks cold the way a drunk drinks rye. You have no inner lining, no plank floor, no vapor barrier. That earth will pull heat out of this room faster than your stove can make it." Peter said nothing. He knew the numbers. He had been running them in his head since the outfit collapsed. "You have one thin door," Tulliff continued, stepping back inside and cataloging with the precision of a man who had survived enough winters to count other men's mistakes. "No inner wall, one smoky stove with a pipe that leaks, less than a quart of fuel that is mostly water, and sheep too thin to sell well at any price Ketchum would offer." He paused. "You cannot winter here." "I have to winter here." "Then you will not winter at all." Tulliff was not being cruel. That was the worst part. He was being accurate. Petter had done the arithmetic himself, scratching figures into the dirt floor with a nail because he could not afford paper. 6 cords of wood at $3 a cord delivered was $18 he did not have. Plank lining for the walls was another $12. A proper stovepipe was $2 in Fort Benton, plus freight. The total came to more than $30, and Pater's entire cash reserve was $4.60 in mixed coin kept in a tobacco tin under his sleeping shelf. $4.60. Eli's passage east from Fort Benton to Billings would cost at least $8. Her winter board was already owed. Every dollar Pater spent on himself was a dollar stolen from the promise that kept him standing. He could sell sheep, but the sheep were collateral against a debt he had not yet seen the full shape of, and the animals were too thin to bring fair price. He could sell wool. The ewes still carried their summer fleece, heavy with grease and burrs, but shearing now before the cold would strip the animals of their own protection, and even if he sheared and sold every pound, the money would go to debt before it went to lumber. The trap was complete. He could not afford shelter. He could not leave. He could not sell what he had without losing what he needed. And then the trap tightened. Milo Ketchum arrived 3 days after Tulliff's visit, on a morning when the first frost had turned the grass white and the sheep's breath hung in clouds above the pen. Ketchum was not old and not young, somewhere past 30, with a clerk's precise handwriting and a buyer's gift for making debt sound like a favor. He worked for a wool buyer based in Fort Benton, and he carried a leather case that held papers the way a doctor's bag held instruments, tools for cutting. He did not come alone. A deputy from the county seat rode beside him, not because violence was expected, but because the presence of a badge turned a conversation into a proceeding. Ketchum dismounted, opened his case on the fence rail, and produced a folded note. He held it so Pater could see the figures but not touch the page. "Your employer owed $11.40 for feed grain delivered last March," Ketchum said. He signed a note pledging the flock as security. When he departed, the note transferred to whoever held the stock. He looked at the sheep. "That appears to be you." Pater looked at the deputy. The deputy looked at the ground. "I was not told about a debt," Pater said. "The debt does not require your knowledge to exist." Ketchum folded the note and placed it back in his case. "I'm authorized to accept payment in cash, in wool at current market rate, or in animals valued at fair condition. These animals are not in fair condition." He paused, letting the arithmetic settle. "You have until the first hard freeze to produce either cash settlement or a flock fit for spring sale. If you cannot do either, I will take the sheep and any claim improvements as partial satisfaction." The deputy said nothing. Ketchum's clerk, a thin boy with ink-stained fingers, had already begun walking the pen, counting heads and marking the poorest fleeces with a chalk stub. Pater watched the chalk marks appear on his sheep like small white wounds. Each mark was a judgment. This one too thin. This fleece too matted. This animal not worth the feed it would eat through winter. "You understand the terms," Ketchum said. It was not a question. Pater understood. He had 83 sheep that he could not sell, could not shear without killing, and could not keep without shelter he could not build. He had a debt he had not made, a deadline he could not meet, and a sister whose future depended on money that did not exist. He had a dirt hole in a hillside that Tolef Moen said would freeze him dead, and winter was 6 weeks away. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as failure. 3 nights after Ketchum's visit, Pater tried to burn his damp willow in the sheet iron stove. The wood hissed and spat. Smoke poured from the cracked pipe joint and filled the dugout until his eyes streamed and his lungs burned. He opened the door to breathe, and the heat, what little the stove had managed to produce, vanished in minutes. The October air poured in like water filling a hole. Within a quarter hour, the inside of the dugout was the same temperature as the outside. He stood in the doorway, coughing, watching his breath dissolve into the dark. That night, he did not sleep in the dugout. He dragged his blanket to the sheep pen and lay down against the fence, where the animals pressed close in their instinct to share warmth. The ground was frozen. His back ached. His left foot, the one that had lost feeling to frostbite 2 winters ago, throbbed with a dull, familiar pain that meant the cold was already working on old damage. But the sheep were warm. He noticed it the way a man notices something he has seen 1,000 times without understanding. The ewes carried frost on their outer wool. Their backs were crusted white, but when he pressed his hand through the fleece to the skin beneath, the skin was warm, not hot, not feverish, just alive. The outside was frozen solid, and the animal underneath did not care. He pulled his hand back and looked at the frost on the wool. It had not melted. The heat from inside the sheep had not reached the surface. Something in the fleece itself was holding the warmth in and the cold out, and doing it so completely that ice could sit on top of a living body without either side noticing the other. That was when his mother's hands came back to him. He was 7 years old, standing in a sheep barn in Hallingdale, watching his mother push raw wool into a crack between the wall planks where winter air whistled through. The wool was greasy, unwashed, still smelling of the animal. She packed it tight with her red-chapped knuckles, pressing until the draft stopped. He had asked her why it worked. She had said something he carried for 19 years without knowing he was carrying it. Wool does not make warmth. Wool holds air still. Still air is what keeps the cold from moving. Fire fights winter after it comes inside. Wool stops winter at the wall. He had not thought about that sentence in years. He thought about it now, standing in a Montana sheep pen with frost on his shoulders and a dugout behind him that bled heat like an open wound. The dirt walls were the problem, not because dirt was cold. Dirt below the frost line held a stable temperature, cool but not killing. The problem was that the surface of the walls conducted heat away from the interior air. Every degree the stove produced, the walls absorbed and passed into the earth behind them. Tolef was right. Dirt drank cold. But Tolef's solution? Plank lining, 6 cords of wood, $30 Pater did not have, was a rich man's answer. Pater had a poor man's material. He had hundreds of pounds of it, walking around his pen, bleeding, raw sheep's wool, grease wool, still heavy with lanolin, the dirtiest, most unsellable part of the fleece, belly wool matted with burrs and dung, neck wool thick with grease, tag ends too filthy for any buyer to accept. The wool Ketchum's clerk had marked with chalk as worthless. What if worthless was exactly what he needed? The design took shape over 3 days, not as a blueprint, but as a series of problems solved in order. Pater walked the dugout's interior with a willow stick, measuring walls and ceiling by arm spans. 12 feet wide, 14 deep, 7 feet at the center peak, 5 at the walls. Total interior surface, roughly 450 square feet of exposed dirt that needed covering. He needed 8 to 10 inches of wool against every surface, walls, ceiling, and the area behind his sleeping shelf. The sleeping alcove would get 12 inches, the thickest layer, because that was where his body would spend the most hours losing heat. The wool would be held in place by a lattice of flexible willow and cottonwood saplings, bent and pinned into the earth walls with wooden stakes. He would not depend on constant fire. The sheet iron stove was unreliable and the fuel was insufficient. Instead, he would use 4 heat sources that cost nothing: the thermal mass of the earth itself, which below frost line held a temperature well above freezing, the body heat of sheep in the adjoining lean-to, which he would connect to the dugout through a low passage, a small stone-shielded lamp niche burning tallow for light and modest warmth, and his own body, wrapped in wool and breathing into a space designed to hold every degree he produced. The idea was not to make heat. The idea was to stop losing it. He tested it first. He found 2 wooden boxes behind the collapsed bunkhouse, each about the size of a bread loaf. He lined one with raw grease wool, 3 inches thick on every side. He left the other bare. He heated 2 stones of similar size in the stove's coals, placed one in each box, sealed both with sod lids, and set them outside the dugout door where the October night could reach them. By morning, the bare box was dead cold. The stone inside had given up its heat to the dirt and the air hours ago. Peter cracked the lid of the wool box and pressed his fingers against the stone. It was warm, not hot. The heat had faded, but warm enough to feel against cold skin. The wool had not made heat. It had slowed the leaving. Bernd Neschheim saw the test. Bernd was 31, a bachelor farmer on a quarter section 2 miles east, the kind of man who survived by skepticism and small margins. He had walked over that morning to borrow a fence staple and found Peter crouched between 2 boxes with his hand inside one of them, smiling for the first time in weeks. "What is this?" Bernd said. Peter showed him. He opened both boxes. He let Bernd feel the difference. Bernd pulled his hand back from the wool box and looked at Peter with the expression of a man who had just been shown a card trick and was trying to find the hidden card. "A box is not a winter," Bernd said. "No. You were talking about lining that entire dugout, walls, ceiling, every surface." "Yes." "With raw wool." "Yes." "The only thing you own that is worth selling. The thing Ketchum will come back for. The thing that could pay your sister's passage." Bernd looked at the sheep pen, then back at Peter. "You are taking the only thing worth selling and stuffing it into a hole." Peter did not argue. Bernd was right about the cost. Every pound of wool packed into a wall was a pound that could not be sold. Every fleece used for insulation was a fleece that would not become cash for Eli's ticket or feed grain or debt payment. The financial logic was clear: sell the wool, survive the economics, and find some other way to survive the cold. But there was no other way. Peter had $4.60. He had no timber. He had no coal. He had a stove that could not heat a room whose walls bled warmth into the earth as fast as fire could produce it. The conventional path, Tollef's path, the path of plank walls, and 6 cords and $30, was closed. The only path left went through the wool. "The smell alone will make you sick," Bernd said. "I've been sleeping beside sheep for 2 years. I know how wool smells." Raw grease wool in a closed dirt room, in winter, with no ventilation. You will be breathing lanolin and sheep dung until your lungs close. Then I will need ventilation. Then you will lose heat through the vents. Peter said nothing for a long moment. Bernd had found the first real problem. A sealed room held warmth but killed the air. A vented room preserved breathing but leaked heat. The balance between the two would determine whether the wool room was a shelter or a coffin. "I do not have the answer to that yet," Peter said. You do not have the answer, Bernd repeated, and you are betting your life. I am betting my life because I have nothing else to bet. Bernd looked at the wool box for a long time. Then he picked up his borrowed staple and walked back toward his quarter section without saying goodbye. The word spread the way words do in a place where 20 families share 100 square miles of grass, slowly, thoroughly, and with embellishment at every retelling. At Grady's store, the only real gathering point between the Basin ranches and the freight road, men repeated the line before Peter had even finished shearing his first animal. Flatten's lining his grave with sheep filth. The phrase had the compression of a verdict. It carried the weight of collective judgment, the kind that settles on a man like soil on a coffin lid. The joke worked because it sounded true. Peter was not building upward like a respectable settler. He was not framing walls or splitting shingles or hauling lumber from the mountain stands the way a man with means and sense would do. He was pushing raw animal grease into dirt. He was stuffing his home with the part of the fleece that buyers refused and decent men burned. He was, to anyone watching, preparing to die in a way that would smell terrible. Milo Ketchum made certain the joke had teeth. Ketchum visited the dugout on a cold afternoon in late October, when the first real frost had hardened the ground and the sky carried the flat white weight that meant snow within days. He brought Tolef Moen and Bernd Neschheim with him, not as allies, but as witnesses. Ketchum understood that humiliation worked best with an audience. He stood in the dugout entrance and looked at what Peter had begun. Raw wool hung in uneven sheets along the back wall, pinned with willow stakes. More wool lay in loose piles on the floor, sorted roughly by length and filth. The air smelled like sheep and wet earth, and something sour that came from the lanolin meeting the damp. "This," Ketchum said, "is what you're doing instead of paying your debt." Peter kept working. He was on his knees, cutting willow saplings to length with a hand axe, fitting them into the lattice that would hold the wool against the wall. Ketchum turned to Tolef. "You see this? Wet wool against wet dirt. When the temperature drops, that wool will freeze to the wall. When it thaws, it will rot. When it rots, it will draw every mouse and beetle in the basin. And when he lights that stove," Ketchum pointed at the sheet iron box in the corner, "the whole pile goes up like tinder." Tolef said nothing. His face carried the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to be used but could not entirely disagree. Bernd stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He had already heard Peter's logic. He did not endorse it, but he was not willing to hand Ketchum a weapon either. Ketchum crouched beside the wall and pressed his fingers into the wool. His hand came away dark with grease. He rubbed his fingers together and looked at Peter. "Wet wool rots," Ketchum said. "Every man in this basin knows that. Wet wool in a closed space breeds sickness. And if you think greasy fleece will not burn, you have never seen a wool shed catch fire." He stood and wiped his hand on his trouser leg. "This is not shelter. This is proof you are unfit to manage stock, and when the freeze comes, I will be back with that proof and a bill of sale." Peter answered with action. He did not argue. He did not explain. He reached for his hand axe, cut a shallow trench along the base of the back wall, 6 inches deep, angled toward the low corner where water pooled, wasan, and began laying flat stones in the bottom. The stones would raise the first course of wool above the seep line. The trench would channel moisture away from the fiber. It was not a full solution, but it was a visible correction made in front of the man who had just declared the project impossible. Then Peter pulled a thin strip of raw wool from the pile, held it near the stove, and let the heat reach it. The wool did not flare. It charred at the edge, shrank, curled, and went dark. It smelled foul, but it did not catch open flame the way dry cotton or straw would have. Wool resisted ignition, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to make Ketchum's fire warning less absolute than it sounded. Ketchum watched. Tollef watched. Burnt watched. None of them said the test meant anything, but none of them looked away from it either. The fire source stays away from the lining, Pater said. The stones keep the wool off standing water. The trench moves seep to the corner. The lattice holds the fiber against the wall without compressing it flat. Ketchum's mouth tightened. He had expected surrender, not procedure. He turned to leave, paused at the door, and looked back. No man beats winter with sheep dirt, he said. Then he was gone, and the deputy with him, and the chalk-fingered clerk. Tollef followed without a word. Burnt lingered long enough to look at the trench, the stones, and the charred wool strip on the floor. He did not say the method would work. He said something smaller. You still have to breathe in here. Then he left too. Pater knelt alone in the dugout, surrounded by the smell of raw wool and damp earth, and began fitting the first willow rib into the wall. Have you ever been dismissed for building something no one else understood? Tell us about it in the comments. We read everyone. The work had no audience after that. Ketchum had made his case. Tollef had made his silence. Bernd had made his warning. The basin had rendered its verdict. Flatten was lining his grave. Pater sheared. He began with the thickest ewes, the ones carrying the heaviest fleece because those animals could lose wool and survive the cold longest before needing cover. He worked with the cracked blade shear, sitting each ewe between his knees the way he had learned as a boy, cutting close, but not so close that skin showed pink through the stubble. Each animal gave him roughly 6 to 7 pounds of raw grease wool, more from the big-framed ewes, less from the yearlings. The wool came off in heavy, oily sheets that smelled of lanolin and grass, and the particular sourness of fleece that had spent a Montana summer collecting dust and burrs. He sorted as he sheared. Long, coarse locks went into one pile. These would become the bulk of the wall insulation, where thickness mattered more than cleanliness. Shorter, crimped fiber from the shoulders and sides went into a second pile. These were the best wool, the only kind a buyer might accept, and Pater set them aside with the care of a man separating food from medicine. Belly wool, matted, filthy, tangled with dung tags and grass seed, went into a third pile. This was the wool Ketchum had marked worthless. It would pack the lowest courses, the draft-stopping layer near the floor where it could be pulled and replaced when moisture reached it. 10 ewes sheared, 60 pounds of wool. He needed at least 500 pounds to line the dugout properly. That meant shearing nearly every animal in the flock, and every animal he sheared was an animal exposed to winter without its natural protection. He solved that problem the only way he could. He made coats. Burlap grain sacks, split and stitched with rawhide cord, draped over the most vulnerable ewes after shearing. Old canvas, the remnant of a wagon cover he had found in the collapsed bunkhouse, cut into crude blankets and tied around the smaller yearlings. The coats were ugly and imperfect. Some animals shook them off within hours. But they were something, and something was the entire distance between Pater's plan and no plan at all. The first frost had come. The second was 2 days behind it. The cottonwood along the creek had gone yellow and then bare in the space of a week, and the wind now carried a dry edge that scraped at exposed skin. Pater could feel the season turning the way a man feels a door closing, not the sound, but the pressure change. He sheared 12 more ewes, 80 more pounds. He bent willow saplings over his knee until they cracked into the curves he needed, then peeled the bark so the wood would dry faster and hold shape against the wall. He cut cottonwood poles into cross pieces and notched them with the hand axe to fit the willow ribs. The lattice would pin the wool against the dirt, hold it in place without compressing it flat, because compressed wool lost the trapped air that made it work. His hands bled. The lanolin in the raw wool softened skin until it split along the knuckle creases, and the willow bark scraped the splits open again with every piece he peeled. He wrapped his fingers in strips torn from his spare shirt and kept working because the alternative was stopping, and stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant counting the days he had left. 21 days until November. 40 sheep still unshorn. 120 pounds of wool sorted and ready to hang. 200 more pounds needed. The lattice ribs covered the back wall and part of the ceiling, but the side walls were still bare dirt, still sweating, still drinking cold. Food was another clock. He had flour for 18 days, beans for 9, coffee gone since last week. He could butcher a sheep, but every animal he killed was an animal that would not produce wool or lambs in spring, and spring was where Eli's future lived. He hung the first panel on the back wall at sunset, working by the light of a tallow candle, because lamp oil was a luxury he had used up in September. The wool went up in a thick, uneven layer, 8 inches at the center, thinner at the edges where the lattice pulled it taut. He packed the gaps with loose fiber, stuffing it in with his bleeding fingers until no dirt showed through. The wall disappeared behind a surface that was brown, oily, and alive with the smell of sheep. He pressed his palm against it. The wool gave slightly, then held. Behind it, the dirt was still cold, still damp, but the air between his hand and the earth was different now. Warmer was not the right word. Less hungry was closer. The wall was no longer pulling heat from the room. It was being held at arm's length by 6 inches of trapped air, tangled in fiber, going nowhere. 1 wall. 3 to go, plus the ceiling, plus the sleeping alcove, plus the passage to the sheep lean-to. And outside, the temperature was dropping a little further every night, and the wind was picking up. And somewhere between Fort Benton and the basin, Milo Ketchum was calculating the date of the first hard freeze and the value of 83 sheep he planned to own by Christmas. Pater pinned the last rib of the first panel, blew out the tallow candle, and lay down on the sleeping shelf with his boots on. His hands throbbed. His left foot ached with the old frostbite memory. The dugout smelled like a shearing shed. He had 20 days. He had not met the woman who would teach him how to make the wool into something stronger than stuffing. He had not solved the ventilation problem that Burnt said would suffocate him. He had not found the answer to the question that mattered more than any other, whether a dirt room wrapped in raw fleece could hold a man's warmth through the kind of cold that killed. He did not know any of those things. He knew only that the back wall was covered, and that when he pressed his hand against it, the cold no longer bit through to his bones. The rest was faith, labor, and a dwindling count of days. The woman appeared on the 4th day of November, walking beside a freight wagon loaded with stiff hides and coils of harness leather. Pater did not see her at first. He was behind the dugout, beating raw wool against a flat stone to shake loose the worst of the dung tags and grass seed, and the sound of the wagon was lost in the wind that had been blowing steadily from the northwest for 3 days. He saw the wagon first, then the driver, a bearded man in a buffalo coat who did not look at him. Then the woman. She was 56 years old, though Pater would not learn that for weeks. She was small, dark-haired, with a face that had been shaped by wind the way a river stone is shaped by current, everything soft worn away, everything essential left sharp. She wore a coat made from something Pater did not recognize. Thick, stiff, felted material, the color of old cream, belted at the waist with braided cord. Her hands were bare despite the cold, and they were the first thing Pater noticed because they were moving. She had stopped walking. She was standing at the edge of the sheep pen, watching Pater beat wool against stone, and her fingers were working against each other in a motion he recognized from his mother's hands, the unconscious rolling, pressing, testing motion of a person who understood fiber the way a carpenter understood grain. Anfisa Karimova did not introduce herself that day. She watched for perhaps 2 minutes, then walked on with the freight wagon toward Fort Benton. But the next morning she was back, on foot, carrying a canvas bundle and a curved stick that looked like a short, flat paddle with a handle worn smooth by decades of use. She stood at the dugout entrance and looked at what Pater had built. The back wall covered, one side wall half done. Wool sorted in piles, willow ribs stacked and peeled, a man working alone on something that would have taken a family. "You're not hoarding," she said. Her English was accented in a way Pater could not place. Not Norwegian, not German, not the Irish brogue he heard from miners. Something farther away. "You are building a wall." Pater stopped working. "Yes. Your wool is too loose. Wind will move through it, and your bottom course is already dark." She pointed at the base of the back wall, where the first layer of belly wool had begun to discolor from moisture seeping up through the stone drainage. Damp wool is dead wool. It holds water instead of air, and water conducts cold 20 times faster than still air does. She said this the way Tolev stated freight costs, as fact, not opinion. Pater looked at the darkened wool. He had noticed it 2 days ago and told himself it was just discoloration. It was not just discoloration. She was right. "Who are you?" Pater said. Her name was Anfisa Karimova. She was a Bashkir Tatar widow from the Orenburg steppe, brought east to Russia as a girl, then west across the ocean with Russian-German traders who valued her skill with leather and fiber. She had been mending harness and making felted saddle pads for freight outfits along the Missouri River for 11 years. She had buried a husband in Kansas and a son in Montana and carried everything she still owned in the canvas bundle on her back. She knew wool the way Pater knew sheep, not from books, but from a life spent handling it. "On the steppe," she said, unwrapping her bundle on the dugout floor, "herders do not stuff wool into walls. They make walls from wool." She pulled out a square of material, dense, firm, a 1/4 inch thick, the color of dark cream. It was not woven. It was not knitted. It was wool that had been pressed, rolled, beaten, and wetted until the individual fibers locked together into a solid sheet. Felt. She held it up to the light from the doorway. "This is what your wool wants to become. Not loose stuffing that mice will nest in and moisture will ruin. Felt. Fibers locked so tight that wind cannot pass, water runs off the surface, and the trapped air stays trapped." Pater touched it. It was warm in his hand, warmer than the loose wool he had been packing into walls for 2 weeks. It had the density of thin leather, but the give of cloth. He could bend it, fold it, press his thumb into it, and feel it spring back. "I cannot make this," he said. "I have no loom, no press." "No." "You have feet," Anfisa said. "You have water, you have canvas, and you have a strong back, which is the only machine that ever made felt on the steppe." She taught him that day. Not with lecture, with labor. First, she showed him how to sort wool by function instead of value. Pater had been sorting by what a buyer would accept. Clean shoulder wool in one pile, filthy belly wool in another. Anfisa sorted differently. Long, coarse outer locks went against the dirt walls, where thickness and oil resistance mattered most. Shorter, crimped fiber from the sides and flanks, the wool with the tightest natural curl, went into the sleeping alcove, where its superior air-trapping structure would do the most work closest to his body. The filthy belly wool stayed at the floor level, but she insisted it be placed on raised willow rails, never touching the stone drainage, and treated as replaceable. "This is your sacrifice wool," she said. "It takes the moisture so the good wool does not. When it darkens, pull it out and burn it. Replace it before the rot moves up." Second, she showed him rough felt. They spread a layer of loose wool on a piece of salvaged canvas, 2 inches thick, the fibers laid crosswise in alternating directions. Anfisa sprinkled water from a tin cup, not enough to soak, just enough to wet. Then she rolled the canvas tight around the wool, tied it with cord, and told Peter to walk on it. He walked on it. He rolled it under his boots, pressing down with his weight, back and forth across the dugout floor, while Anfisa counted strokes. After 50 passes, she unrolled the canvas. The wool had changed. The loose fibers were beginning to tangle, locking into each other where the pressure and moisture forced them together. It was not felt yet, not the dense, firm material she had shown him, but it was no longer loose stuffing. It was a mat that held its shape when she picked it up. "More rolling, more locking," she said. "You do not need perfection. You need enough that wind cannot pass and mice cannot pull it apart. For wall panels, 50 more passes. For the sleeping alcove, 100. Peter looked at the single small mat in his hands, then at the 450 square feet of wall and ceiling that needed covering. "How long?" he said. "With 2 people, 3 weeks. With 1 person and bad wool, 5. He did not have 5 weeks. He might not have 3. The sky that morning was the color of old lead, and the wind carried the taste of something metallic that Peter's body recognized before his mind did. The first breath of real winter, still distant but moving. Third, Anfisa taught ventilation. She walked the dugout with the focus of a woman diagnosing a sick animal, pressing her hand to walls, crouching at the floor, standing on the sleeping shelf to feel the ceiling. "A warm hole without breath becomes a coffin," she said. She said it flatly, without drama, the way a person states something they have seen go wrong. "You need 2 vents, one low, near where the sheep air enters from the lean-to. One high, through the sod roof, placed on the side away from the prevailing wind. The low vent brings in cool air that has been warmed slightly by passing the sheep. The high vent lets out the breath fog and smoke before it condenses on the wool and ruins everything you have built." She cut 2 holes. The low vent was the width of a man's fist, angled downward from inside to prevent rain entry, positioned where the dugout met the sheep lean-to passage. The high vent was slightly larger, cut through the sod roof at the back corner, lined with a short piece of bark to keep dirt from crumbling into the opening. Over each vent, she hung a rawhide flap attached to a willow toggle. Open when the air thickens, close when the wind screams. The flaps slow the draft without stopping it. You will learn the rhythm. If you wake with a headache, the vents are too closed. If you wake with frost on the inner wall, the vents are too open. Fourth, she taught moisture discipline. This was not a single lesson, but a principle she repeated every day she was present, in different words, until Peter could hear her voice in his head when she was not there. Never let wool sit in standing water. Trench the floor and keep the trench clear. Raise the lowest wool course on stones or willow rails so air circulates beneath it. Check the bottom of every panel by touch every morning. Dry wool feels springy and warm. Damp wool feels dense and cold. If a panel darkens at the base, pull the lowest 6 inches, burn it, and replace it with fresh belly wool. Do not wait. Do not hope it dries. Damp wool breeds rot, and rot moves upward, like fire moves upward, slowly at first, then all at once. "The wall is alive," Anfisa said. If you treat it like lumber, it will die. If you treat it like a flock, it will live. Progress came in numbers Pater tracked by scratching marks into a ceiling beam. 7 wall panels hung and felted, 14 more needed. 3 ceiling ribs cracked under the weight of wet wool and replaced with thicker cottonwood poles. 40 sheep still unshorn. 120 pounds of sorted wool processed into rough felt mats. 200 more pounds needed to finish the side walls and sleeping alcove. 26 days until deep winter by Tolef's estimate. Food, flour for 12 days now, beans for 6, coffee still gone, salt running low. Anfisa came every second or third day, walking from wherever the freight outfit camped. She never stayed the night. She never explained where she slept. She arrived with her canvas bundle, worked beside Pedir for hours, corrected his technique when the felt mats came out uneven, and left before dark. She ate nothing of his food. She brought her own, dried meat and a flat, hard bread he did not recognize, and shared without being asked. On her 5th visit, a wet Chinook wind came down from the mountains and raised the temperature 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The frozen ground softened. The dugout walls began to sweat. Moisture beaded on the exposed dirt above the wool line and ran down behind the panels Pater had already hung. By evening, the first lower course on the side wall smelled sour. The sharp, curdled smell of wool-absorbing water it should have been shedding. Anfisa arrived the next morning, pressed her hand to the darkened wool, and pulled the entire bottom course off the wall. 6 days of work, gone. "This is not failure," she said, laying the ruined wool outside to dry in the sun. "This is the wall telling you where the water lives. Now you know. Raise the rail, add a stone course under the sidewall to match what you did on the back, and leave a finger's width of air between the stone and the first wool layer." Pater rebuilt the sidewall base that day. The lesson cost him a week of felt he could not replace until he sheared more ewes, but it taught him something the box test could not. The dugout was not a box. It was a living system with its own moisture patterns, its own breathing, its own weaknesses. Wool could hold warmth against the cold, but only if the wool itself stayed dry. The insulation worked. The problem was keeping the insulation alive. Mice appeared on the 3rd day after the Chinook. They came up through the drainage trench and nested in the belly wool along the floor line. Pater found droppings in the morning and 2 nests by afternoon, each one a fist-sized hollow chewed into the raw fiber. The mice were eating the lanolin-rich locks and using the shredded wool for bedding. If they spread, they would hollow out the lower course in weeks. Anfisa showed him the old method: cedar shavings scattered under the bottom rails, the smell sharp enough to drive mice to easier nesting, wood ash from the stove spread in the drainage trench, making the stone channel hostile to soft paws. She pinned sprigs of dried sage between the rails and the wool, not because sage repelled mice with certainty, but because the combined smell, cedar, ash, sage, made the wool wall less attractive than the open prairie. "You cannot kill every mouse," she said. "You can make them prefer to live somewhere else." The mice thinned. They did not vanish. Pater accepted this the way he accepted the damp, as a condition to be managed, not defeated. And then Ketchum returned with money. He came on a bright, cold morning in mid-November, alone this time, without the deputy or the chalk-fingered clerk. His manner was different, less legal, more conversational, which made Petter more cautious, not less. Ketchum carried no leather case. He carried a cloth purse. "I will make this simple," Ketchum said. "I have a buyer who needs clean shoulder wool before the river freezes. He will pay 40 cents a pound for sorted, bagged grease wool in sellable condition. You have, 200 pounds of good fiber in those piles?" Pater had 230 pounds of clean shoulder and flank wool, separated and bagged for exactly this possibility. It was the best wool from the first 43 sheep he had sheared. At 40 cents a pound, it was worth $92, enough to pay the debt, cover Eli's passage, buy flour and salt for the winter, and still have money left. $92. More money than Pater had held in 2 years. He looked at the bags. He looked at the dugout walls where the panels thinned at the edges and the ceiling still had gaps where bare dirt showed through. 230 pounds of good wool was the difference between finished insulation and a room with holes that winter would find and exploit. "How much of the debt does this cover?" Pater said. "All of it. You would be clear, free and clear with cash remaining." Pater stood between the bags and the walls. Every calculation he had ever made converged on this moment. Eli's passage, the debt, food for winter, against a wool-lined dirt room that the entire basin said was a grave. He sold 2 bags, 80 pounds of clean shoulder wool, $32. Enough to cover the debt and put $6 toward Eli's board, with nothing left over. He kept the rest, 150 pounds of good wool that Ketchum wanted and could not have. Ketchum counted the money out, wrote a receipt, and looked at the remaining bags. "You are making a mistake," he said. "I have made nothing but mistakes since September," Pater replied. "At least this one keeps me warm." Ketchum left with his wool and his receipt. Pater stood in the dugout doorway with $32 he did not have yesterday and 150 pounds of insulation he could not replace. The walls were still unfinished, the ceiling still gaped, the sleeping alcove was 2/3 done. And the money he had just earned, money that should have made him safer, had only purchased a narrower margin between completion and catastrophe. That evening, Bernd Nesheim appeared at the dugout, carrying an armload of crooked saplings. He set them against the wall without ceremony. "These are no good for fence posts," Bernd said. "The bends are wrong. I thought you could use them for that cage you're building in there." Pater looked at the saplings. They were perfect for willow ribs, long, flexible, already dried enough to hold shape. They were exactly what he needed to frame the remaining ceiling panels. "Thank you," Pater said. "I do not want the smell blowing my direction. The sooner you close that hole up, the sooner the basin stops suffering." Bernd turned and walked back toward his quarter section. He did not look back. 2 mornings later, Pater found a short length of stovepipe leaning against the dugout door. The pipe was scratched and dented, but intact, without cracks. No note, no name. But the boot prints in the frost were wide and deep, and the wagon tracks leading back to the freight road matched Tolef Mohn's rig. Tolef would not endorse the method. He would not say the wool room could work, but he would leave a man a stovepipe in the dark, because leaving someone to freeze was a different thing than admitting they were right, and Tolef Mohn understood the difference. Pater fitted the new pipe that afternoon. The stove drew clean for the first time since September. He kept the flames small, not for warmth, but for cooking, for boiling water, for the thin comfort of a fire that did not fill his lungs with smoke. The heat the stove produced was minor, but with the new pipe drawing properly and the wool panels absorbing instead of bleeding, even that minor heat lingered in the room longer than it ever had before. He could feel the difference now. Not warmth exactly. Stillness. The air inside the dugout had stopped moving. The drafts that had cut along the floor and spiraled up the walls were blocked by felt and pinned fiber and rawhide vent flaps. The cold had not disappeared. It was still there, pressing against the other side of the wool, patient and enormous. But it could no longer walk freely through the room. It had to wait. It had to push through 8 inches of trapped air, inch by inch, and by the time it reached the interior surface, the heat from Pater's body, from the sheep in the lean-to, from the small stove, had already replaced what was lost. He was not winning. He was slowing the rate of losing, and in a Montana winter, that might be the only kind of winning that existed. The wool lining was completed in the first week of January, 1888. Pater hung the last ceiling panel on a night when the stars burned so hard and clear that the sky looked like a wound full of salt. The dugout was finished. From outside, it looked worse than it had in September. A low dirt mouth in a cut bank, the door patched with canvas, vent flaps twitching in the wind. The sheep lean-to leaning slightly eastward, where a November gust had shifted the poles. The smell reached 20 yards. Wet wool, lanolin, sheep dung, wood ash, and the particular sweetness of tallow that had been burning in a closed space for weeks. From inside, it was another country. Sound died against the walls. The wind that screamed over the cut bank registered as a low hum, a vibration in the sod roof, a pressure against the vent flaps, but not as the cutting, seeping invasion it had been before. The air was still, not warm in the way a heated room is warm, but still in a way that felt like safety. The sleeping alcove where the wool was thickest, nearly 12 inches of rough felt and layered fiber, held a temperature that kept the water cup on the shelf from skinning over with ice. In a room where everything else was below freezing, the alcove was above it, not by much, but by enough. Pater tested it with the tools he had. A cup of water set near the door froze overnight, a thin sheet of ice that crackled under his fingertip by morning. The same cup, placed on the sleeping shelf inside the alcove, stayed liquid. Not warm, not comfortable to drink, but liquid. The distinction between frozen water and liquid water was the distinction between a room that could sustain life and a room that could not. A tallow scrap pressed against the back wall remained soft enough to dent with a thumbnail. On the bare dirt wall above the wool line, the last 6 inches where the ceiling met the bank, frost still formed. But below the wool, the wall surface was dry. Not warm, dry. The moisture that had sweated through all autumn was being held at bay by the wool and the airspace behind it. Tolliff Moan came back. He stood in the dugout for a long time, touching walls, pressing the wool, looking at the vent flaps, examining the stone drainage trench. He did not say the room was safe. He said, "It is drier than I expected." Then he left. Bernd Nesheim arrived an hour later. He walked the full interior, ran his hand along the sleeping alcove, felt the liquid water in the cup, and said, "The next clipper will settle it." Ketchum did not visit. He did not need to. His verdict was already public, already settled, already the consensus of every man in the basin who believed that winter was a problem solved by wood and iron, not by wool and dirt. The sky changed on January 11th. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west for a week, swung northwest in a single afternoon. The temperature, which had been cold but stable, 10 degrees above zero, livable, ordinary, began to fall. Not gradually. The air sharpened. The quality of the cold changed from something that pressed against exposed skin to something that bit. By evening, the thermometer at Grady's store, the only reliable instrument in the basin, read 4 below zero and still dropping. Snow began, not the thick, wet flakes of a normal storm. Hard, dry grains that slid across the frozen ground like sand across glass. The wind picked them up and drove them horizontal, filling every crack, every gap, every space between boards. The snow did not fall. It flew. Pater knew what was coming. Every shepherd in Montana knew the signs. A fast-moving low sweeping down from the Canadian plains, the kind the basin men called a norther, and the weathermen in the cities would learn to call an Alberta Clipper. It moved fast, hit hard, and left temperatures that killed livestock standing in their tracks. He moved the weakest ewes into the lean-to. 14 animals in a space meant for 8, their bodies pressed together, their breath rising in a single cloud that filled the low passage between the lean-to and the dugout. He banked snow against the outer sod, packing it by hand, armload after armload, building a crude windbreak over the vent flaps and along the base of the door. He checked the rawhide toggles on both vents, high vent half open, low vent cracked a finger's width. He tied a rope from the dugout door to the sheep pen, 40 feet of braided cord that would be the only guide between shelter and animals if the visibility dropped to nothing. Then he went inside, pulled the canvas patch door shut, and listened. The storm arrived after midnight, not gradually, like a wall. The door boards shuddered. The vent flaps, which had been twitching gently all evening, slammed shut and had to be propped open with wooden pegs to keep any air moving. The sound was not wind in the way that word usually meant. It was pressure, a constant vibrating force that pushed against every surface of the dugout as if the air itself had become solid and was trying to crush the cut bank flat. Peter lay on the sleeping shelf and felt the wool walls flex. Not much. A slight inward bulge along the side wall where the lattice was thinnest, then a settling back as the gust passed. The wool absorbed the pressure the way it absorbed everything. Slowly, silently, giving ground without breaking. The temperature fell through the floor. He could not see a thermometer, but he could feel it in the way the air changed inside the dugout. The door seam where canvas met wood met sod developed a line of frost that grew inward like white moss. The water cup near the door froze solid, not a skin of ice, but frozen to the bottom. The air in the main room dropped below freezing. Peter's breath became visible, hanging in clouds that drifted toward the high vent and disappeared. But the sleeping alcove held. He pressed his hand against the 12-inch wool wall and felt it give slightly, then hold. The surface was cool, not cold, not the dead mineral cold of exposed dirt. A living cool, like touching an animal's flank in winter, the surface lower than body temperature but warmed from behind by something the cold could not reach. He checked the water cup on the shelf. Liquid, not warm, not comfortable, but liquid. The sheep lean-to was another world. 14 ewes packed so tight they could barely turn. The smell was extraordinary. Wool, dung, urine, breath, lanolin, all compressed into a space 8 feet by 10. But the low passage between the lean-to and the dugout was doing what Anfisa had designed it to do. Warm, moist air, heated by the bodies of 14 sheep, each one a living furnace burning grass and grain into approximately 100 watts of thermal energy, drifted through the passage into the dugout, where it mixed with the still air of the wool-lined room and raised the temperature just enough to matter. The first night passed. The wind did not stop. The second morning, Peter opened the door and could not see the sheep pen. The rope disappeared into white. The snow was not falling anymore. It was being torn from the ground and driven sideways so fast that the air itself was opaque. The temperature at Grady's store, 3 miles east, would later be estimated at 38 degrees below zero. At the cut bank, sheltered from the worst wind, it might have been 5 degrees warmer. It did not matter. At either temperature, exposed skin froze in minutes and flesh began to die in less than an hour. He pulled the rope. It held. He pulled harder. It jerked against something. A drift had buried the pen gate, and the rope ran through it like a thread through frozen cloth. He could follow it, or he could stay. He stayed. The sheep in the pen had each other and their wool. The ones in the lean-to had the dugout wall. If you need to know what happens next, subscribe now and stay with this story because the worst is not over yet. The pounding came at noon on the second day. A single blow against the dugout door, then nothing. Peter opened the door into a blast of cold that hit his face like a fist. The temperature inside the dugout plunged 10 degrees in the time the door was open. Frost bloomed on the inner latch. The wool panels nearest the door darkened as moisture in the air froze instantly against the cooler surface. Bernd Nesheim was on the ground outside the door. One cheek was white, dead white, the color of tallow, the color skin turns when the blood has stopped reaching it. His hands were bare. His coat was caked with snow driven so deep into the wool that it looked like plaster. He had lost his hat, his mittens, and most of the feeling in his right foot. Peter dragged him inside. The door slammed shut. The cold that had entered the room began to dissipate, but slowly the wool walls were absorbing the thermal shock, and it would take an hour for the sleeping alcove to recover. "Roof came in," Bernd said. His voice was thick. His lips were cracked and gray. "Drift on the north wall. The sod buckled. I tried to reach Tolev." He stopped talking. His eyes were not focusing on anything in the room. Peter stripped the frozen coat off Bernd and wrapped him in the one blanket from the sleeping shelf. He pressed a warm wool compress. A rough felt mat, heated by laying it over the sheep, leaned to passage where the animal warmth rose. Against Bernd's white cheek, the frostbite was surface deep. If the blood returned soon, the skin might live. If not, the cheek would blacken, and the flesh would die, and Bernd would carry the mark for the rest of his life. The lamb was worse. Peter had found it that morning, pressed against the lean-to gate, half buried in drift that had blown through a gap in the poles. A late lamb, born too small and too late to carry the fat reserves it needed. Its body temperature had dropped below the threshold where shivering works. It was still alive. Peter could feel the faint, rapid heartbeat under the thin skin, but it was not moving, not bleeding, not doing anything except dying very slowly. He brought it inside. He tucked it against the sleeping alcove wall, where the 12 inches of wool held the only warmth in the room. He covered it with loose fiber. He did what Anfisa had taught him: trap the air, slow the loss. Let the body do its own work. The dugout was now shelter for one man, one frostbitten neighbor, 14 sheep, and one dying lamb. The door seam was frosted white. The high vent was closed to a slit. The low vent was cracked open just enough that the air did not turn sour. The wool walls had darkened near the door, moisture from the opening, but the interior panels held. The sleeping alcove held. The water cup on the shelf was still liquid. But Bernd looked at Peter with his one good eye, the other squeezed shut against the pain of the thawing cheek, and said, "Tolev may still be outside." Peter looked at the door. On the other side of it was a world where a man could die in the time it took to walk 50 yards. The rope led to the sheep pen, not to Tolev's place. The visibility was 0. The temperature was 40 below with wind. He tied the rope around his own waist, checked the knot twice, and opened the door. The cold was not air. It was a substance. It filled his lungs and burned. It found the gap between his collar and his neck and drove into the skin like a blade. He could not see. He could not hear anything except the wind, which was not a sound but a wall of pressure that pushed him sideways as he stepped away from the door. He crawled. The rope paid out behind him, the only connection between his body and the only warm room within reach. 15 yards. The rope stretched. The wind knocked him flat. Snow filled his eyes, his ears, the space between his shirt and his skin. He pulled himself forward on his elbows, calling Tolef's name into a void that ate sound the way the dirt walls used to eat heat. The rope jerked. He had reached its limit. 40 feet from the door, blind, on his belly in snow that was not falling but flying, with no way to know if Tolef was 5 yards ahead or 5 miles. He lay there for 10 seconds. The cold was already in his hands. His left foot, the old frostbite foot, had gone from pain to nothing, which was worse. He could search for 5 more minutes and find Tolef, or he could search for 5 more minutes and lose himself. He turned around. He pulled himself back along the rope, hand over hand, until his fingers found the door frame and he fell into the dugout, and Burnt kicked the door shut behind him. "He is not there," Pater said. He did not know if that was true. He knew only that the rope was not long enough, and his body was not strong enough, and the storm did not care about either. Anfisa's voice in his head closed the high vent halfway, open the low vent 1 finger more. The breath fog from 2 men and 14 sheep was building inside the dugout, condensing on the coolest surfaces, threatening to soak the wool near the ceiling. He adjusted the vents. He pressed a fresh, warm compress to Berndt's cheek. He checked the lamb, still alive, still not moving, still breathing in the thin, rapid pattern that meant its body was spending everything it had on the single task of not dying. The third morning came with silence. Not quiet. Silence. The wind stopped as if someone had closed a door. The sky was white and still, and the temperature was so far below zero that the air itself seemed brittle, as if a loud sound might crack it. Pater opened the door. The world was white. The sheep pen was a mound. The cutbank was sculpted into ridges and hollows that looked nothing like the landscape he knew. He followed the rope to the pen and found the ewes huddled in a mass, alive, frost-crusted, bleeding at the sound of his voice. The news came in pieces over the next 3 days, as the basin thawed enough for people to move. Tolef had survived. He made it back to his own freighter's dugout, but only after burning nearly a full week's supply of wood in a single night. His walls were plank-lined and well-built, but the heat fled through the boards so fast that the stove could not keep pace. By morning, the water bucket beside his bed had frozen solid, despite the fire burning 3 feet away. He lived, but he burned through wood he could not replace for weeks. Ketchum's hired man was found alive in a wagon box, 3 miles north of the freight road. The canvas top had frozen stiff. The firewood he carried had blown out from under the seat during the first hours of the storm. He survived by pulling hides over himself and lying still, but 3 fingers on his left hand were dead, white and hard, and past saving. He would lose them at the knuckle. A neighbor's plank shack, one of the better-built homes in the basin, with real lumber walls and a good iron stove, kept its fire burning all 3 nights. The wood supply held, but the walls leaked heat so fast that the water bucket froze solid beside the bed. The stove could not raise the room temperature above freezing during the worst hours, and the family spent the storm huddled around the firebox, feeding it constantly, sleeping in shifts to keep the fire alive. Pater's dugout held, not perfectly, not without cost. The wool near the door had darkened with moisture from the 2 openings, once for Bernd, once for the rope search. The lower panels on the side walls showed damp where the drainage trench had overflowed during a thaw cycle. The air inside had been thick and foul by the 3rd morning, carrying the accumulated breath of men and sheep and the sour smell of wet lanolin. But the water cup in the sleeping alcove never froze solid. Bernt's frost-bitten cheek turned pink, then red, then began to peel, damaged, but alive. The lamb survived. It was standing by the 4th day, wobbling against the lean-to wall on legs that looked too thin to hold it. And Petter's woodpile, The cord of willow and cottonwood that Tolliff had said was not enough to keep a stove burning for a week was nearly untouched. He had not burned it because he had not needed to. The wool had done what his mother said it would do. It held the air still. It kept the cold from moving. It did not make warmth. It kept warmth from leaving. The stove had cooked his food and boiled water for Burnt's compress. It had not heated the room. The room did not need heating. It needed keeping. Burnt sat on the sleeping shelf on the fourth morning, his cheek bandaged with a strip of clean wool, the lamb asleep against his leg, and looked at the walls that the entire basin had called a grave. Ketchum said no man beats winter with sheep dirt, Burnt said. Pater said nothing. He was replacing the damp lower course near the door, pulling out darkened fiber and packing fresh belly wool onto the raised rail. The work was the same as it had always been. The dugout was alive and needed tending. I am not saying he was wrong about everything, Burnt continued, but he was wrong about this. Outside, the sun hit the basin for the first time in 4 days. The snow glittered so bright it hurt to look at. Somewhere to the north, Ketchum's hired man was counting the fingers he would lose. Somewhere to the east, Tolliff was stacking the wood he should not have had to burn. And inside a dirt hole lined with raw sheep's wool, a man who owned almost nothing had kept 2 lives and a lamb from freezing without burning more than a handful of sticks. The storm was over, but the story was not. Because surviving was one thing. What Peter Flatten did with survival was another thing entirely, and the basin had not yet begun to understand what it had just witnessed. The basin counted its losses in the week that followed. 2 men dead, a freighter caught between stations on the Fort Benton Road, and an old bachelor whose soddy chimney had choked with drift, filling the room with smoke until he opened the door to breathe, and the cold finished what the smoke had started. Livestock losses were harder to count because the drifts had not fully melted, but the estimates moved through Grady's store like a second storm. 300 head of cattle dead in the Judith Basin alone, another 200 across the divide, sheep frozen in clusters where they had pressed together and been buried. Pater lost 11 ewes from the open pen. The ones in the lean-to survived. Everyone. The first visitor came on the 6th day after the storm, while Pater was hauling damp wool out of the dugout and spreading it on the frozen ground to dry. It was not Tolliff. It was not Bernd. It was a woman Pater had never spoken to, the widow of a homesteader on the South Fork, who had spent the storm in a plank cabin with her 3 children, huddled around a stove that could not keep water liquid 6 feet from the firebox. She did not ask about the theory. She did not ask about sheep or lanolin or the physics of trapped air. She asked one question. Can you show me how to line a wall? Pater showed her. He pulled a felted panel from the back wall, one of the good ones, still dry, still springy, and demonstrated how the lattice held it in place. He showed her the raised rail at the bottom. He showed her the drainage trench. He showed her the sacrifice wool at the floor line and the cleaner felt above it. He explained the sorting, coarse locks for thickness, crimped fiber for the sleeping area, belly wool for the replaceable lower course. She listened with the intensity of a woman for whom this was not curiosity, but survival. Her children would face another storm. Her stove wood was half gone. She could not afford to replace it before spring, and spring was 3 months away. I do not have sheep, she said. You have neighbors with sheep. The belly wool is the part they throw away. Ask for it. They will give it because it costs them nothing. She left with a felted sample the size of a dinner plate and a list of steps Peter scratched onto a scrap of brown paper with charcoal. Within a week she had lined one wall of her cellar, the north wall, the one that bled cold all winter, with raw wool hung on a sapling lattice, the bottom course raised on stones. Tolliff Moan came on the 8th day. He arrived on foot, which was unusual for a man who drove a freight wagon everywhere, and Peter understood that the walk was deliberate. Tolliff did not want the distance of a wagon between himself and what he had come to say. He entered the dugout without knocking, as he had the first time. He stood in the center and looked at the walls with the careful attention of a man revising a calculation he had been certain about. He pressed the wool on the back wall. He touched the ceiling panels. He crouched at the drainage trench and ran his finger along the stone. He examined the vent flaps, the rawhide toggles, the low passage to the lean-to. He looked at the sleeping alcove, the 12-inch walls, the shelf, the water cup that had not frozen even during the worst hours of the storm. Then he looked at the wood pile, the cord of willow and cottonwood that he had declared insufficient 3 months earlier. It was nearly intact. A few sticks missing for cooking, a few more burned during Barent's first hours, when Peter had heated water for compresses. But the pile was recognizable as a pile, not the scattered remnants of a supply burned through in desperation. Tolliff stood there for a long time. The silence in the dugout was the particular silence of wool-lined walls, not empty, but absorbed, as if the room itself were listening. "I said dirt drinks cold the way a drunk drinks rye," Tolliff said finally. "I did not know wool could make it sip." He did not say the method was proven. He did not say he had been wrong. He said the specific thing he had been wrong about and corrected it with precision, the way a man who respects accuracy corrects a ledger entry. The walls still drank cold. The wool controlled how fast. Peter nodded. He did not need more than that. Tolliff left. But the next day, a woman from 2 sections over arrived asking how to hang wool in a root cellar. The day after that, a rancher's hired hand came with questions about the lean-to passage and whether cattle could warm a soddy the way sheep warmed a dugout. The day after that, the school teacher, a young man from Illinois who had never seen a Montana winter before this one, asked whether wool panels could cover the north wall of the schoolhouse, where drafts cut through the plank siding so fiercely that children on the far bench could not hold a pencil. Each person came with a specific problem. Peter answered with specific solutions. He did not lecture. He showed. He pulled panels off the wall and demonstrated the lattice. He let visitors feel the difference between the wool side and the exposed dirt above the wool line. He sorted wool in front of them, separating locks by length and crimp, explaining which type went where and why. He showed the sacrifice wool, darkened, replaced, burned, and said the words that mattered most. The method fails if you do not maintain it. Check the bottom every morning. Replace what darkens. The wall is alive. He shared freely. He charged nothing. He refused payment when it was offered. A sack of flour from the widow, a ham from the rancher, coffee from the school teacher. This was not charity or saintliness. It was strategy. If he sold the knowledge, he became a tradesman. If he gave it, he became a source. And a source could not be replaced by a man like Milo Ketchum, who was already calculating how to turn someone else's survival into his own profit. Anfisa returned in late January, thinner than when she had left, walking more slowly, carrying the same canvas bundle but with less weight to her step. She coughed when she entered the dugout, a wet, deep cough that lived in her chest and came out with a sound like cloth tearing. "The freight outfit moved to Helena," she said. "I stayed." She did not explain why she stayed. She did not need to. Her lungs were worse. The cold aggravated whatever the years of smoke and step wind and freight camp fires had planted there. Helena was farther, colder on the road, and she no longer had the endurance for the walk. Peter gave her the sleeping alcove. She refused it the first night and slept on the floor near the lean-to passage, where the sheep warmth came through. The second night, the cough woke them both, and Peter moved her to the shelf without asking permission. She did not refuse again. They worked together through February, not as teacher and student anymore. The balance had shifted. Anfisa's hands were still more skilled than Pater's, her understanding of fibers still deeper, but her body was failing, and Pater's was not. He did the heavy work, hauling wool, beating felt, replacing damp courses, cutting saplings. She did the precise work, finishing edges on felt panels so they hung flush, adjusting vent openings by fractions, diagnosing problems in the dugout's breathing by pressing her ear to the wall and listening for the particular whistle that meant air was moving where it should not. They disagreed about the lean-to. Pater wanted to enlarge it, add another 4 feet, enough for 20 sheep instead of 14. Anfisa said no. More animals meant more moisture. More moisture meant more maintenance. The system worked at this scale because one man could manage it. If it grew beyond what one man could inspect, replace, and maintain daily, it would fail. "You are thinking like a builder," she said. "Think like a shepherd. A flock that outgrows its pasture dies. A shelter that outgrows its keeper rots." Pater pushed back. "More sheep means more warmth. More warmth means less cold reaching the wool. More sheep means more breath. More breath means more water in the air. More water means the wool saturates faster. You are not adding warmth. You are adding moisture with warmth as a side effect. And moisture is what kills your walls." She coughed again, long and wet, and spat into a rag she kept in her coat pocket. "I have seen this mistake on the steppe. A family adds 2 more animals to the winter shelter because the animals are warm. By spring, the felt is ruined and the shelter needs rebuilding. The best shelter is the smallest one that keeps you alive, no larger." Pater did not enlarge the lean-to. The days took on a rhythm. Morning, check the sacrifice wool, replace what had darkened, clear the drainage trench. Midday, shear the remaining ewes as the weather allowed, sort the new fiber, begin felting panels for neighbors who had asked. Evening, adjust the vents, bank snow against the outer sod, bring the weakest animals into the lean-to. Night, the dugout held its warmth. The sheep breathed through the passage, and 2 people shared a silence that was not loneliness, but partnership. Anfisa told him about the steppe, not in speeches, in fragments, offered the way a person offers food, when there was some to spare, and not before. She described the gears her grandmother built, wooden lattice frames covered in felted wool, portable, warm, able to withstand winds that knocked plank houses flat. She described the felt-making circles where women worked in teams, rolling and trampling the wool in rhythm, singing songs whose purpose was not beauty, but timing. Each verse told the worker when to shift weight, when to add water, when to stop. She described her husband once, a German-Russian trader who had recognized her skill with leather and hired her before he married her. He died of fever in Kansas in 1879. She described her son once, born on the Missouri, died in Montana at 14 of the same lung weakness that was now killing her. She described these losses the way she described ventilation, as facts with consequences, not as invitations to grief. Pater told her about Eli, about the passage money he still owed, about the promise that held him to this basin when every practical calculation said he should leave. "The promise is the shelter," Anfisa said. "The dugout is just the wall." In early March, the hostile pressure that Pater had expected from Ketchum arrived, but in a form he had not predicted. Ketchum did not challenge the wool method directly anymore. The storm had made that argument too expensive to maintain. Instead, he adapted. He began selling what he had previously mocked. Word reached Grady's store that Ketchum was offering prepared insulation bundles, raw wool, roughly sorted, bundled in canvas sacks with a printed instruction sheet for $2.50 per bundle. The wool was low grade, short staple, poorly sorted, much of it the floor sweepings from shearing sheds that buyers had rejected. The instruction sheet was wrong in ways that mattered. It did not mention the raised rail at the bottom. It did not mention drainage trenches. It did not mention the difference between coarse outer locks and crimped sleeping alcove fiber. It told buyers to pack the wool tight against the wall, which compressed the fiber and destroyed the trapped air structure that made the insulation work. Pater heard about the bundles from the school teacher, who had been offered one and suspected it was inadequate. "He is selling the failure," Pater told Anfisa. "Someone will buy that bundle, pack it flat against a wet wall, and when the wool rots and the room fills with mold, Ketchum will say the method does not work. He is selling the proof that I'm wrong." Anfisa looked at him with the expression she wore when he had found a problem, but not its shape. "He is not selling proof. He is selling wool, bad wool, at a good price. The proof is a side effect he will enjoy, but the money is the purpose. How do I stop it? You do not stop a man from selling. You make what he sells worthless by giving away what works." Pater understood. The method was free. The knowledge was free. Every person who learned the correct technique from Pater, the sorting, the raised rail, the drainage, the sacrifice wool, the vent discipline, was a person who did not need Ketchum's bundle. And every person who succeeded with the correct method was a walking advertisement against the bundles that failed. He taught at the church supper. Anfisa came with him coughing but present, and they demonstrated the full process: sorting, felting, hanging, maintaining. 23 people attended. Pater answered every question. He refused money. He offered labor exchange. He would help hang their first wall in return for help shearing his remaining flock. Ketchum was at the supper. He sat in the back and said nothing during the demonstration. When Pater finished, Ketchum stood and said, "This is very educational, but my bundles are available for those who prefer convenience." He left before anyone could respond. 6 people bought Ketchum's bundles. 4 of them came back to Pater within a month, asking why their wool had blackened at the bottom and their rooms smelled like rot. He showed them the raised rail. He showed them the drainage trench. He replaced their ruined lower courses with properly sorted belly wool and taught them the morning check. Ketchum sold no more bundles after April. If this story reminds you why preparation and knowledge matter more than shortcuts, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The secondary crisis came in late March, during a season that should have been easing toward spring, but was not done punishing. A late storm swept through the basin during lambing. Not as severe as the January Clipper, the temperature dropped to 15 below, not 40. But devastating in a different way, because the ewes were dropping lambs into a world that was still trying to kill them. Lambing in a Montana. March was already dangerous work. Ewes needed shelter. Newborn lambs, wet from birth, could freeze in minutes if exposed to wind. A rancher with good barns and deep straw and hired hands could manage. A basin full of small settlers with sod houses, patched shacks, and depleted woodpiles could not. Ketchum's warehouse, the largest covered space in the basin, served as an unofficial lambing shelter for ranchers who paid him storage fees. It had plank walls, a board roof, and enough space for 40 ewes. But the walls leaked. The boards had dried and shrunk over 3 summers, and the gaps between them let wind cut through like water through a sieve. During the storm, the temperature inside the warehouse dropped below freezing despite 2 stoves burning full. 7 lambs died in the first night, born wet, chilled before they could stand, dead before their mothers could clean them. Pater learned about the losses from Barent, who arrived at the dugout with a look on his face that Peter had learned to read. It meant someone needed help, and Bernd did not want to be the one to ask. The Hjelmstad U's are dropping in Ketchum's warehouse, Bernd said. They lost 7 last night. The wind comes through the west wall, like the boards are not there. Peter did not wait for the request. He loaded his remaining felted panels, 6 good mats, each roughly 4 by 6 feet, onto a handcart he had built from the bunkhouse wreckage, and walked 3 miles through wind and snow to Ketchum's warehouse. What he found was chaos managed by exhaustion. 8 ewes in active labor, 11 newborn lambs, most of them shivering, some of them nursing, 2 of them lying still on the straw with their legs folded beneath them in the posture of animals that had stopped trying. 3 men worked the floor. Ketchum's hired man, the one who had lost fingers to the January storm, his left hand now wrapped in a permanent bandage, and 2 ranchers whose faces carried the gray, flat expression of men who had been awake for 30 hours. The west wall was the problem. Peter could feel it the moment he entered, a steady, invisible river of cold air pouring through the gaps between the boards. The stoves fought it and lost. Every degree of heat they produced bled through the west wall before it could reach the animals on the floor. Peter hung the felted mats against the inside of the west wall. He pinned them with nails he borrowed from Ketchum's supply shelf without asking. The mats did not cover the entire wall. They covered perhaps 1/3 of it, the section closest to where the weakest ewes lay. But 1/3 was enough to break the draft in that area, to create a pocket of still air, where the stove's heat could accumulate instead of vanishing. He worked without speaking to Ketchum, who stood at the far end of the warehouse watching. Ketchum did not help. He did not interfere. He watched a man nail wool to his wall and said nothing. Within an hour, the temperature in the sheltered area had risen noticeably. Not warm, not close to warm, but above the threshold where wet lambs could dry before they froze. A ewe dropped a lamb on the straw directly beneath one of the felted mats. The lamb lay wet and steaming in the cold air, and its mother began cleaning it, and the lamb was still alive 20 minutes later, which was 20 minutes longer than the lambs born against the unlined wall had managed. Over the next 3 days, Peter converted a root cellar behind the warehouse into a secondary lambing shelter. He lined it with wool, not felted panels, which he did not have enough of, but raw grease wool hung on a hastily built sapling lattice with stones at the bottom and a vent cut through the earthen roof. It was crude work, done fast, without the care he had given his own dugout. But it worked. The root cellar held warmth. The lambs born inside it survived. 23 lambs saved from 3 neighboring flocks over 4 days. Not all Peter's doing. The ranchers worked alongside him, learning as they labored, asking questions that Peter answered while his hands kept moving. But the knowledge was his, and the technique was Anfisa's, and the combination saved animals that would have died if the only shelter available had been Ketchum's leaking warehouse. Ketchum's reaction was the most revealing moment in their entire conflict. On the 4th day, when the storm had passed and the surviving lambs were nursing in the lined root cellar, Ketchum came to the cellar entrance and stood there. He looked at the wool on the walls. He looked at the lambs. He looked at the drainage trench Peter had cut in the earthen floor, identical to the one in his own dugout. "You used my nails," Ketchum said. "I will pay for them," Peter said. Ketchum stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the warehouse. He did not ask for payment. He did not tear down the wool. He did not mention the nails again. Something had shifted. Not broken. Ketchum was not a man who broke. But shifted, the way a load shifts on a wagon when one wheel finds a rut. The weight was still there. It was just sitting differently. Anfisa did not come to the warehouse. She was too weak. The cough had settled into something permanent, not the occasional interruption it had been in January, but a constant presence, a third body in the dugout that demanded space and attention. She slept more. She ate less. Her hands still moved with precision when she worked, but the work tired her faster, and by evening she sat on the sleeping shelf with her back against the 12-inch wool wall and her eyes closed, breathing in the shallow, careful way of a person for whom each breath costs something. Peter did not ask about her illness. He did not need to. He had watched enough animals die to recognize the stages, and the recognition sat in his chest like a stone he could feel but could not remove. She knew. Of course she knew. She had been traveling with the freight outfits for 11 years, sleeping in camps where smoke was constant, and cold was the air you breathed, and clean water was a luxury that came and went. Her lungs had been carrying this weight longer than she had been carrying the canvas bundle. On a warm afternoon in April, warm meaning 35 degrees, warm enough that the snow on the cut bank dripped and the sheep stood in the pen with their faces tipped toward the sun, Anfisa sat outside the dugout door and watched Peter teaching Berndt's youngest nephew how to roll felt mats. "You teach the part that works," she said. "That is good, but you must also teach the part that fails." "I do. The damp, the drainage, the sacrifice wool." "Not only the technical failure, the failure of scale, the failure of laziness, the failure of a man who hangs wool one year and never checks it again because he believes it is done. Wool insulation is not a wall, it is a practice. If you teach it as a wall, it will rot, and people will say it never worked. If you teach it as a practice, they will maintain it, and it will outlast the building it hangs in." She coughed. It went on for a long time. When it stopped, she said, "I taught you the step method. You changed it for Montana. Someone will change it again for somewhere else. The method travels. The principle stays. Teach the principle." 2 weeks later, a freight wagon stopped at the cut bank. The driver told Anfisa there was a Catholic charity ward in Fort Benton that took in sick travelers. She could ride. No charge. The driver owed someone a favor, and the favor was a seat on the wagon for a sick woman. Anfisa packed her canvas bundle. She gave Peter the curved felting stick, the paddle-shaped tool with the handle worn smooth by 30 years of use. She said, "Teach the part that fails, too." She did not say goodbye. She climbed onto the wagon with the careful, measured movements of a person who knows exactly how much effort they have left and will not waste a fraction of it on ceremony. Peter watched the wagon until it was a dark point on the freight road, and then until it was nothing. He hung the felting stick above the dugout door that evening. He drove a willow peg into the lintel and set the stick across it so it rested there like a crossbeam in miniature, the handle pointing inward, the flat paddle facing the basin. It was not decoration. It was not a memorial. It was the only object left behind by a woman who had carried everything she owned on her back and given away the one tool that mattered most. The word came 6 weeks later, carried by a different freight driver on a different wagon. Anfisa Karamova had died in the charity ward at Fort Benton. The driver did not know the details. He said she had been quiet. He said the sisters had buried her in the Catholic cemetery outside town, in a grave marked with a wooden cross and no surname because nobody at the ward could spell Karimova. Peter did not go to the grave. Fort Benton was 60 miles away, and the sheep needed shearing, and the ewes were pregnant, and the dugout walls needed their spring inspection. These were not excuses. They were the continuation of the work Anfisa had taught him, and she would have understood that the work was the memorial, not the visit. He cried once, in the sleeping alcove, at night, with his face pressed against the 12-inch wool wall that smelled of lanolin and still held the faint warmth of the earth behind it. He cried the way a man cries who has lost the person who taught him the thing that saved his life. Not loudly, not for long, but with a completeness that left him empty and still. The next morning, he replaced the sacrifice wool along the south wall. He cleared the drainage trench. He adjusted the high vent for spring air. He taught Burnt how to make a removable felted panel for the north wall of his rebuilt soddy. He answered 3 questions from a homesteader passing through. He checked the pregnant ewes. The felting stick hung above the door. Anfisa's knowledge was in his hands. The only version of her that still lived was the practice, the sorting, the felting, the venting, the maintaining, the teaching, the daily discipline of keeping a wall alive. If Pater stopped practicing, that version died too. He did not stop. Spring revealed what winter had hidden. The snow drew back from the cut bank in layers, each layer exposing a different record of the season. Frozen sheep dung near the pen, a lost mitten stiff as wood, the rope Pater had crawled along during the January storm still tied to the doorpost, frayed where the drift had sawed against it. The basin emerged slowly, the way a face emerges from behind a hand, familiar but changed. Pater inspected the dugout on the first warm day in April. Warm meant 42 degrees. Warm meant he could work without gloves and the mud under his boots had give. The damage was honest. 4 lower wool courses had to come out. Darkened past saving, heavy with moisture that had wicked up from the drainage trench during the last thaw-freeze cycles of March. The sacrifice wool along the floor had done its job, absorbing the worst of the seep, but the line between sacrifice and structural had blurred in 2 places where Pater had not replaced quickly enough. He pulled the ruined panels, carried them 50 yards from the dugout, and burned them. The smoke smelled like a shearing shed that had caught fire, greasy, thick, acrid, and it drifted across the basin for an hour. He did not hide the damage. When Burnt came to help with the spring inspection, Pater showed him the blackened wool and the stains on the dirt wall behind it. "This is what happens when you wait too long," Pater said. "I should have pulled these panels in February. I knew the bottom was darkening. I told myself it would hold until spring. It did not hold." Burnt looked at the stains. "If the method is this fragile—" "The method is not fragile. I was lazy. The wall told me it needed attention, and I waited because I was tired, and the storm was over, and I thought the worst had passed." He pressed his hand against the exposed dirt where the wool had been. The earth was cold and damp, just as it had been the day he arrived.